Halo, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Perkenalkan, nama saya Haru Baria. Di sini ada Nurmulia Sneni. Kami dari tim Education Core, seleksi National University Debating Championship Unhas Internal Selection 2021. So this is actually a technical meeting, but we decided to record the technical meeting for you to access it in YouTube. So in this technical meeting, we will explain you the material on debating and how you should do the debating. So let's just start it. So first, we will be talking about debating format. So we are using debating format of British parliamentary debate. How is BP format or British parliamentary format? So we have government bench and also opposition bench with 4 team position. We have opening government, we have opening opposition, we have closing government, and we have closing opposition. Each position of team have 2 speakers inside. We have prime minister and deputy prime minister, leader of opposition, deputy leader of opposition. And the flow of speech or talking inside the debate is OG will come first. After that, OO will come first. So when OG with Prime Minister comes, after OG with Prime Minister doing the speech, opening opposition with leader of opposition will come the aftermath, and continuously that way. So the tournament format, there will be prelims and as well as elimination rounds. In this selection, we have 2 preliminary rounds and 2 elimination rounds. Top 3 speakers from final round will be the delegates of Universitas Hasanuddin to the regional selection. And 4 teams, we have 4 teams: opening government, open opposition, closing government, and closing opposition. The substantive speech will run about 7 minutes and 20 seconds. In case building duration is 15 minutes, so you have 15 minutes time to prepare your speech before you speech in 7 minutes and 20 seconds. The point of information is allowed between the first and 6 minutes of the substantive speech. So if we so you have to time yourself, or we will share screen to stopwatch you, and when it shows the time of the very first minute, so it means that the PUI is allowed, and when it's 6 minutes, the PUI is not allowed anymore. Next, on team's role. So this is the general team's role for BP format. If you are in OG, your role is to provide problem and set up. You also have to give arguments and extensions and responses to opening opposition. As opening opposition, you have to do engagement first to opening government cases, and you have to respond to opening government argumentations. And after that, you make your own argument and you make your own extension of the debate. In closing government, you have to bring a new extension or a new argument that is different from the opening government, but still on the same position of supporting the motion. Second, you have to do is response to opening opposition and closing opposition, and as a whip, you have to do rebuttals and clashes, and no new argument allowed. In closing opposition, I mean here, you need to do new extension response to opening government and closing government case 2, and as a whip, you have to do rebuttals and clashes and no new argument allowed. So that's the general team's role of each position of teams. Next, we go more specific into the roles of opening government. So in opening government, we have 2 speakers. The first speaker named Prime Minister. So as a Prime Minister, your role is to set a clear debate. How to do a clear debate is by setting or presenting a context and a problem. What is the context of the motion? What are the problems that occur from the motion till we have to debate upon the motion? Second, you have to provide a clear and reasonable definition, which means a debatable and within the context and the spirit of the motion. So you have to make a definition that can be operationalized throughout the debate. We do not expect a definition that only define the specific keyword of the motion, referring to, for example, the definition from Wikipedia. We expect the debater to do more job in defining the keywords of the motion that is contextual to the debate and can be operationalized throughout the debate. For example, if the motion reads, this house would ban this house would ban this house would ban zoo, you have to define what is zoo, and not necessarily just defining zoo as a place where there are a lot of animals inside, but you have to make a definition that can be operationalized. For example, you mentioned that zoo is a place where animals are being kept and utilized as a form of entertainment for the visitors, for example. So that's what we mean by a definition that can be operationalized. Third of all, you have to do stance uh, and mechanism if needed, then explain how it solves the problem. So you have to mention for the problems and the definition that you have mentioned above, what is your stance? What do you want to do with the problem? Sometimes most of debaters would repeat what the motion reads, but you can also search for another words that explains on what you want to do about the problems, and mechanism if needed, and explain how you solve the problem. So mechanism basically is the procedures or ways of you achieving your uh, your stance. So you have to explain in systematically, like first we will do A, second we will do B, for us to understand if you want to do the motion, how you mechanize it in status quo or how you would implement it in status quo. Fourth, you have to mention your goal. So mentioning goal, the purpose of mentioning goal is to make the debate clear of out of the problems that you have told us, out of the definition, the stance and mechanism, what is your ending goal that you want to achieve. Lastly is setting what exactly will we be talking about. So this is important to make the debate clear for opposition, also adjudicators, for us to understand what you want to actually become, what you want to become the focus of the debate. Next, you have to bring your arguments. So as prime minister, what you have to keep in mind is that you should not restrict the debate to certain areas or countries or a time frame unless the motion requires so. So if the motion does not uh, obviously mentioning certain areas or countries or certain period of time, you should not limit the debate upon that certain areas, countries, or time frame unless the motion mentioned it to begin with. Otherwise, you can actually contextualize the debate into certain areas or time frame to add more upon the framing and context. So it's not that you are limiting the debate on certain countries only, or you mentioning this debate will only be implemented in Indonesia, but you can explain that the motion, the spirit of the motion can be contextualized in countries like Indonesia, countries like Philippines, for example. So you mention a lot of areas or countries or time frame that is upon the spirit on the motions to add more contextualization and to add more framing of the scenarios and the visualization of the motion if you would like to implement it in status quo. Second is on opening government. So as deputy prime minister, the second speaker in opening government, you have to do three things in general. You have to respond and engage, you have to bring extension, and lastly, you have to briefly sum up the key points. So on response and engagement, first thing that you have to do is you have to answer the rebuttal from your opponent. So after your prime minister's speech, the leader of opposition will do their speech too. So after the leader of opposition do their speech, you as a deputy prime minister and as second speaker from opening government, what you have to do is to answer the questions mentioned by the leader of opposition and rebutting the argumentation from your leader of opposition case. So not only you are answering questions if they ask you, but you also have to rebut their points of argumentation in order to rumble down their points. Second is you have to rebuild your team case that has been attacked by your opponent. So sometimes leader of opposition will attack or will rebut the argumentation that have been built in prime minister. In order for you to still maintain and keep this point become a strong point in your position as opening government, you have to rebuild your team case. Rebuilding the team case can be done by, for example, you are clarifying your points. Maybe there are some points that are not understood well by the leader of opposition, or some points that just that leader of opposition just cherry pick from your argumentation. And lastly, you can also do, for example, rebutting their rebut from your points. So that's how you rebuild your team case. The last thing that you can also do is by giving them more burden of proving why your case is not better than their rebuttals, for example. The next thing you have to do is bring new rebuttal and argument. So uh, you have to do also rebuttals upon other argumentation that does not directly engage to your prime minister cases. And after that, you have to build your argument. This is an extension from coming from an argumentation that has been there from prime minister. Next, you have to tell the judge why the opening debate answered the most important question. So because in your team as opening government, as your position as opening government, you only have two speakers. So as the last speaker from opening government, you have to steal the attention of the debate. You have to mention and you have to explain to the judge as well as your opponent why your team as opening government answer the most important questions in the debate. You have to mention to the judge that these are the important questions, these are the things that have to be proved, that have to be proven as the government team, or that have to be prioritized upon the motion. And you have to explain why you answer that all and why you cover all that concerns from the motion. Okay, so next you have to bring extension, an argument which supports your team's claims, and it must be different from the previous speaker's argument, but still relevant and consistent. So as a deputy prime minister, you are expected to bring a new argumentation as an extension of your team's case. Sometimes an extension can also be still in the same nuance or in the same context with your prime minister. However, the way of you explaining this context or this nuance is in different way. So that's okay for you to still talk about the same thing, but maybe with a different way. But you are also suggested to bring a new extension or a whole new different argument from your prime minister to diversify your argumentation or your team's case. Lastly, you have to briefly sum up the key points. So sometimes as a deputy prime minister, because the role is to extend what your prime minister have taught on the debate, your role is also to explain it deeper about your prime minister case, and you have also to rebut the leader of opposition and proving why all teams cannot answer the most important questions on the debate. So sometimes judge or your opponents um, need a clear sum up of the points that you think important on the debate and have to be considered and have to be weighed by the judge. So don't forget to briefly sum up your points after you explain all the things on the response and on your extension arguments. And what, as a deputy prime minister, what you have to keep in mind is that the deputy's extension does not always have to be entirely different from prime minister. You can extend, complete the points or premise brought by your prime minister, as what I've explained before. Okay, next we go to opening opposition. So opening opposition, first speaker, we have leader of opposition. The role is as similar as above. You have to respond and engage. You have to bring extension, and lastly, you have to sum up your key points. In response and engagement, you have to rebut prime minister case. So because you are the first speaker in opening opposition, and you are the first speaker who have to rebut the point from Prime Minister, so you are becoming the first response of the debate. So you have to make sure that points that you rebut are the most important points that is brought by your Prime Minister, and you have to make sure that you bring the rebuttals and you bring response and engagement towards their point, for you to also have a leverage on your scores. Second is you have to provide better solution or counter model if necessary. This is not obligatory. Sometimes in a debate, opposition can agree that the solution is what mentioned by the team government or team opening government, but the solution does not bring any benefit, for example, or the solution will only give worse scenarios, for example. So sometimes in a debate, you can concede that the solution is what the opening government mentioned, but your roles as opposition is to explain to us why that solution might be the answer, but does no good in status quo and just harms, right? Or if you think that you have another solution that is more approachable, that is better and strategically better, you can also mention and provide us the better solution in your perspective as opposition. Third of all, you have to tell the judge why the opening debate answered the most important question. So this is also the same role in similar role as above. You have to mention to the whole bench and the adjudicators why opening bench answered the most important questions in the debate, and why opening opposition takes the upper hand in explaining why being the opposite from the motion is better than being the affirmative. Okay. Next is bringing extension. So you have to make an argumentation as what we have explained above, and lastly, briefly sum up the key points. What leader of opposition have to keep in mind, this is not changed yet. What leader of opposition have to keep in mind is that I think what you have to keep in mind is that can you can either just accept the solution or the problems mentioned by the prime minister, or you can unvalidate, you can not validating what they also say, like what I have explained before. Next, on opening opposition is deputy leader of opposition. So on deputy leader opposition, the roles are much the same too. You have to answer and rebuttal from your opponent, rebut your team case that has been attacked by your opponent, bring you rebuttals, and etc. etc. So the roles are much of the same. But maybe what you have to keep in mind is you have to question yourself as opposition. Does the problem really exist? If that exists, is the status quo working? Is the solution or the policies that is available in status quo is working or enough? Can the status quo be improved? If you want to improve status quo, how is that way? Is it using your way, or is it using government's way? Or will the solution offered by the government team be effective to solve the problem, or only worsen the situation? This is what I mentioned before about whether you want to concede on the problem and the solution comes from the government as well as the goals, or you want to make a new one that you think on your perspective as opposition is very much better. Next, we go to the closing bench. So on closing bench, in general, what you have to do and what you should do is, first you have to tell judges what is missing from the opening debates. Or maybe you can explain to judge that in opening debate, deadlocks happen, or they do not, or what do we mean by deadlocks is that opening government and opening opposition talks about the same gravity of problem, or the same gravity of a better solution, but no one of them would like, for example, to conceding each other or engaging to each other cases. So there is a deadlock happen because maybe the problem mentioned by the government is also urgent, but the solution coming from the opposition is very much better than the solution coming from the government side of the house. But no team would like to engage upon the worst scenario of whether, for example, the problem isn't that urgent, or in opposition, for example, the solution is not that better. So maybe in closing bench, you notice that it happens in opening bench. So you have to take that chance to explain to judge that the opening bench does not contribute very much well in the debate, because they are just making the debate become a deadlock. So in closing bench, if you see that the opening bench making a deadlock, you have to break this deadlock and explain to judge what should be prioritized, what is more urgent. If that's not really urgent, what are the alternatives that we have in status quo? If it's not the priority, what are the other priority that is more important? For example, the second thing that you can do or you should do is have the same stance with your opening, but you can always bring additional mechanism to the solution to perfect the solution. So as a closing bench, you still have to stand on the same position of either you are supporting the motion or you are not supporting the motion, right? So still have to do it. You still have to argue on the same standing point, but you can add more mechanism or more contextualization for the debate that can gives more gravity upon the problem, upon what should be prioritized the most, upon what's more important to be debated. Third of all, you have to provide distinct arguments different from the opening. So as closing bench, you have to bring new argumentation, new lens of perspective, though you are still standing on the same position or standing point. This is important in order for you to differentiate your team's case with the opening team's case. If we think that your case is just as similar as the opening's case, it's very hard for us to find the identity of your team. So, for example, if the opening case talks about the principle of the debate, also talks about the practicalities of the debate, maybe in closing bench, you still want to talk about the principle of the debate, but in a different argumentation that you framed it as very much important, as more important in comparison to the principle mentioned by the opening government case. So you have to make sure that you give a distinct argumentation and mention to us in the debate why you are different from the opening government case, team's case. The next that you have to do is you have to add new justification or effectivity to the solution if necessary. So sometimes a closing bench admit that the solution comes from the opening from your opening bench are effective, or the solution is good and the solution is true. But for you to also take the upper hand, or for you also to take the scores from this justification or this solution, you have to make a new justification why it's effective, why it's a better solution. So instead, you just following what the opening government what the opening opposition talk about, you add more, or maybe you claim that their explanation is not enough to say that the solution is effective, and you take the points of explaining what are the justifications that make this solution effective, for you to have a more identity, that your case explain a lot about the effectivity of the solution in comparison to the opening bench. So you'll take more credit upon that if we think that your explanation gives so much significance on the debate. Next, the thing that you have to do is add contextualization or picturization of the condition that brings more urgency to the problem. So this is also a way for you to distinct yourself. You explain in a various contextualization, or you visualize the debate in a more detailed and specific way to bring more gravity upon the urgency of the problem. And the last thing that you have to do is bring new rebuttals to opponent teams. So because you are in closing bench, most likely you have to rebut the themes from the government. You have also to not rebutting your government, but claiming that your government explanation is not enough. For the opening opposition, you have to rebut them, and for the closing opposition, you have also to rebut them. So basically, the job that you have to do is to differentiate yourself from your opening bench, example, opening opposition, and to claim that the team case of opening opposition and closing opposition does not give so much contribution to the debate, and your case is the most important thing to the debate. So each team in BP debate should steal the attention for their own teams, not just for a government side or opposition side. It's either you are government side in opening or closing bench, so you have to steal the spotlight. And what the closing team should not do is first have completely different solution when the opening team solution is very debatable. So sometimes in the debate, we can sense that this one team is an alien in the debate. When the opening debate proposes a solution, and when the closing, example, closing opposition, if you're closing government, your closing opposition also accept the solution, and all of the three teams agree upon that goal, agree upon that solution, and you come to the debate by offering a new solution. When the things that have been told by these other three teams are very much debatable, or very much can be elaborate more, maybe you are not suggested to have a completely different solution, unless you can explain to the judge and the whole bench that your new and very different solution is the thing that is more contextual, that is more relatable from the of the spirit of the motion, for example. Maybe, for example, maybe the other three teams does not consider an actor analysis that is very much impacted inside of the debate, and they're just talking about the effect of the motion. They're talking about the solution of the motion, but no one of them talk about the actor of the motion. So maybe as a team that want to propose a different solution, you think that the most important thing that have to be debate and have to be the focus of the motion is the actor. So you bring this actor analysis and explain to us why that actor is the most important elements of the debate that have to be considered more. Maybe we can buy that argumentation, and that can be, and you can steal the spotlight of the debate. But if you do not sure that those people are the most important thing, or your solution can be explained rationally, we suggest you to follow uh, the debate that have been there, and elaborate it more, that makes you different and makes you more attractive to be seen by the judge. Second, what you should not do is bring nothing new to the debate. So if you bring nothing new to the debate, we will not consider you as a team that have an identity. So in BP debate, an identity of a team is very important, because there are four teams that we judge in this debate. If you have a case, you do speech, 7 minute speech, but most of your entire case is just as similar as your opening bench, for example, we can consider you for bring nothing to the debate, bring nothing new to the debate. So we cannot credit you for all your 7 minute speeches with an argumentation that have been there before, or with an argumentation that is just as similar as your opening debate. So we do not suggest you to bring nothing new to the debate. So you have to try very hard and force yourself to bring a new argumentation, new analysis, new standpoint of view to the debate. So as member of closing bench, as the second speaker of closing bench, that thing that you have to do is explain where closing team different from the opening team, bring new rebuttals, bring new arguments. Okay, so you are as member, your role is as a whip, right? So you have to bring rebuttals, you have to bring clashes to the debate. What you have to look at is that you have to follow the dynamics of the debate and see what are the points that is mostly debated in the debate, for you to be able to see what is the important thing to make, what is the important thing that can be made into clash, right? So you have to follow the dynamics of the debate, and you have to see what points that considered as the most talked point and the most important point to be talked about and upon the spirit of the motion. Okay, so these are much the same of what I explained. Okay, so the next thing that a whip can do is you have to bring rebuttals, you have to give biased conclusion of the debate. What do we mean by biased conclusion of the debate is if you are closing government, you have to give a biased conclusion that your case is the best case in comparison to other 14 cases. And you have to offer to the adjudicator how the debate should be judged based on the closing government or your team's perspective, and explain why your team answers that how the debate should be run. And lastly, you have to give comparison of why your team is the best among others. So these are much the same of what I've explained. Okay. Next, we talk about opposition approach. So I mentioned earlier that as an opposition, you have an option of whether you want to accept the problems mentioned by your government, or you accept the solution offered by the government team. But these are another thing that you can also consider if you are an opposition in a team. Okay, so first of all, you can do accepting you can do not accepting the problem. So when the government team say that the problem is A, you can say that the problem is not A. So the first approach that you can do is that say the problem doesn't exist, or say the problem uh, yes, the problem that is mentioned by the government team does not exist at all. The second approach that you can do is admitting that the problem exists, but the status quo can solve that. This is what I mean by you accepting that the problem mentioned by the government team exists and the problem is there, the problem are that, but the solution is not what offered by the government, but the solution is already there in status quo. There are lots of policies, there are lots of things that have been done in status quo, and why the things that have been done and the policies in status quo are enough, and why it is still progressing to a better outcome. So you claim that status quo can still solve the problem that exists. The third thing that you can do is that admitting that problem exists, but government solution will only making things worse. So you can explain that the solution coming from the government team will only making things worse in status quo. For example, if they implement a new policy, there would be a new scope of actor, for example, that is harmed, or there would be a rejection, a huge rejection coming from the society, for example, and yada yada yada. So you can analyze if you admit the problem exists from the government, but you feel that the solution will only give problems, so you can use this approach. And lastly, that the problem exists, but opposition has a better alternative. Maybe you have another solution that is not exists in status quo, but new, and you think that it's better in solving the problem. So you can use this approach. Okay. Next, we go to motions. So in here, we'll be talking about types of motions. So there are many types of motions. The first type of motion is the proposal motions. Sometimes it reads this house would. The motion, wait, pardon, wait. Okay, so the first type of motion is a proposal motion. Sometimes reads this house would. So in this motion, unless specified by the motion, that this house is the government. So sometimes there are motions that only mention this house as the United Nations, or this house as progressive political parties. But if this house is not specified, you have to assume that this house is the government. The second is the burden of proof, or BOP, is usually to explain first, will the proposal solve the problem your team proposes? Second is implementing the proposal morally justified. So these are the most occurring burden of proof that you can explain in a debate in a motion of this house would. If you are opposition in the motion of this house would, the opposition burden of proof is up to the stance that opposition decides to take. So you have to choose the options of opposition approach above for you to understand first what is your stance in the debate. The most questions that occur if you are in opposition in a this household motion is that first, why implementing the motion is morally wrong, why implementing the motion would create another harm. So if you are confused of how you have to run the motion, or you do not know the issue at all, you have to question this upon the motion. It may help you to understand what's the problem, what's the issue of the motion to begin with. The second type of motion is this house believes that. So this is a motion that sometimes want to prove that something is harmful, or something is sometimes something do more harms than good, something is better than the other, someone is better to do this or not. So the burden of proof of this house believes that motion is usually to prove why the statement is true or untrue. So you just have to explain why the statement of this house believes that blah 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 is true or not. Next is this house acts as X should do Y. So you have to identify yourself as X. So this is a type of motion that this house is specified, this house as X. You have to identify yourself as X and know what is X interest and characteristics. So example, if you are the motion reads this house as feminist movement, you have to know what is the interest of feminist movement, what are the characteristics of a feminist movement, what are the movements that they have done in state school, how they react and respond to different uh, women issues in status quo, what are their stances to another movement, how governments see this movement, and what are the what are the rejection issue that is available in status quo. So the burden of proof of this house as should do Y motion is first, will the proposal achieve X interest, or is the proposal fits the characteristic of X? Second is implementing the proposal morally acceptable from X perspective. So you have to put yourself as X and put everything in priority for X. So everything that you want to do in the motion, you have to validate first whether all the things that you want to do is fitting the interest, fitting the characteristic, and the perspective of X. As opposition, your burden proof is also up to the stance that opposition decided to take. So you have to question yourself first. What is the approach that you want to take? You can read this; it's very much clear. Okay, so it's just much the same of above type of motion, but in this case, you have to put a priority on X perspective. Next type of motion is this house believes that X should do Y. So this is not as X you should do Y, but you believe that X should do Y. For example, this house believes that feminist movement should do their campaign outside of political sphere, for example. Not this house as feminist movement believes that campaigning outside of political sphere is better. So it's a different type of motion and it reads different, so it needs a different approach. So the burden of proof of this type of motion is that you have to question why is it good or bad for X to do Y? Is it morally correct for X to do Y? So you have to question yourself whether, for example, feminist movement, is it good for feminist movement to just campaigning outside of the political sphere, or the feminist movement will get so much benefit if they're also campaigning for political sphere, whether they can do whether they can just choose one of the options of campaigning inside or out, and etc etc. So you have to do a lot of questions there. The next type of motion is evaluative motions, like this house regrets or this house celebrates. So this motion usually debate on certain phenomena or trends that are happening in the world. Unless specified, it uses the perspective of a third party actor. So if the motion does not specify again the actor or which perspective that you have to take, so you have to assume that you are as a third party actor that want to judge a phenomenon or a trans in status quo. So this motion is not reads like this house as feminist movement regrets. No. So this motion reads like this house regrets the action or the campaign from feminist movement that blah 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 blah. So that's how it looks like. Wait a minute. I I want to just laptop first. Hold on. So sometimes the burden of proof is simple. You have to question why the trends are regrettable. And for opposition, it's also vice versa, why the trends are worth celebrating or the trends is not regrettable at all. And the important note for this is that evaluative motions are not about actions. This type of motion does not require any model nor proposal. It is simply evaluating the trend that are happening. So you are not required to give models. For example, you are regretting the action of feminist movement of X, and you are giving a model of what the feminist movement should have do instead. So you are not required to give a model there, but you are suggested to give a model, for example, if it's celebrating, because if you want to celebrate something, we are expected you to explain how you would like to celebrate it, or you want to describe or portray how status quo celebrates something. So maybe it's not necessarily comes from your perspective of how you would like to celebrate something, but you are mentioning of what is already there in status quo when people celebrate something. For example, let's say the celebration looks like a massive socialization. A celebration also looks like huge event made specifically for that things that is celebrated, and yeah. So you can explain it that way. Next, on the types of motion, judgment motion. This house supports, this house promotes. So this is also similar. If it's not specified, you are third party actors, and you have to put your perspective on the third party analysis. The burden of proof is also similar, why the proposition is good or bad in solving certain problems, why the proposition is morally acceptable or unacceptable. So maybe you want to ask why supporting X action is good or bad in solving problems that occur in status quo, or why promoting certain action is good in solving certain problems or not in status quo. So that's basically it. The next type of motion is direct comparative motion. This house prefer X over Y, or this house prefer X to Y. So if any other motion opposition stance could vary according to their strategy, this motion specifically set the comparative for opposition to defend, resulting into a direct comparison for both teams. So both teams have to compare why you prefer X in comparison to Y, and in opposition, you have to explain why you prefer Y over X. So the burden of proof is basically why X is better than Y, or why Y is better than X. So that's basically it. The point that is more important, the thing that you have to do that is more important in this motion is you have to make a comparative, a literal comparative of these are the characters. For example, these are the characteristic of X, these are the characteristic of Y, and why Y is better than X, or why X is better than Y, or why X is not is worse than Y, and vice versa. So basically, that's it from me. I think Nanny can take the uh, presentation now. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you, Kafira, for a very clear explanation. Now I'm going to explain about setting up the debate. So there are several important components when you want to set up a debate. So yeah, next slide, Kafira. So first, you need to provide the context and the problem. So context and problem actually in a form of background. So what are the problems that actually happen through the motion that has been given. So the motions need to you if you want to create a setup, then you need to make sure that you understand about the problem of the motion. So without the problem, you cannot understand what actually think that you are going to discuss. So that is very important to understand about the problem within the status quo. So secondly, you need to provide definition and also mechanism. So why this is important? Because in order for you to explain the process of your argumentation, then judges need to understand what how you define the motion, then how you create a mechanism or the process where you want to achieve your goals or the stance. And the third thing is stance and goal. So stance and goal actually, what are you going to achieve on that motion, whether you want to create change or whether you want to achieve a certain situation that might not exist in the status quo. So explain what is your goal and your stance. For example, like in the motion, this house would allow prisoners to vote. So you need to explain why then prisoners actually need to vote, why they have right to vote, and why that is important to vote. So yes, explain the goals of your motion. And lastly, framing and showing what your opponent should do in order to win the debate. So BOP, or burden of proof, is not actually only by your team, but also it must be in the form of you also provide or throwing BOP to your opponent. Because yes, whenever your opponent unable to answer that kind of BOP or your the question on the debate, actually you can win the debate. So that is the simple setup you can follow through the debate. And next slide, how to work with your argument, or what kind of ideal argument, or what uh, things that you need to complete on your argumentation. So basically, there are four things that you need to do in order to complete your argument, which is complete the RL, or first make your assertion. So why you need to make assertion? The assertion actually in a form of statement. It can be in a form of question, or it can be in a form of deductive statement. So why assertion is important, right? This is important because you want to make sure that adjudicator actually could understand and follow your speech. This is in a form of signposting. The reason why this is important, because assertion makes people understand what you are going to explain. And also secondly, it's improve your speech structure, and also it is in a form of reminder what you are going to prove in 7-20 minutes, right? So in order for you to make assertion, you need to make sure that your statement easy to follow and easy to understand. And secondly, how to make it then? There are two kinds of way to make a statement. Firstly, a question statement, and secondly, a conclusion of what you're trying to prove, or in a form of deductive sentence. So in here, the example of the motion, this house would provide unconditional income paid by government to all citizens. So the question would be, you can ask in the form of question statement why it needs to be in the form of unconditional money, or in the deductive statements, or you explain the summary, or you explain what the conclusion of your argumentation or your reasoning, your arguments. You can explain unconditional money is the key to achieve basic happiness of having an option. So the key points, or the key words that you need to use in the deductive statement, are actually the sentence that could conclude and or could summarize all the argumentation that you already explained. So that is how you make your assertion. Secondly, how to elaborate reasoning. So reasoning, actually the reason why your assertion is true, or why your assertion is valid. So the reasoning must be in the form of you can explain why is it true, does the argument follow a logical explanation. And this is also the reason why reasoning is important, because we want to avoid any kind of logical gap or any kind of loophole that might be exist on your argumentation. So for example, if you want to explain whether it's a moral thing to do, or you want to explain the grounded principle of your assertion, and for arguments that wish to explain causalities and impact, and also the adjudicator have the expectation on how your premises will lead into the impact that you claim will exist. Notice it is very important to explain the process of it. So reasoning is one of the important component in complete your arguments, because sometimes debaters just want to explain why A is valid or why A is true, without necessarily explain the reason why A is true, right? This is important because to complete your argumentation, then judges need to value whether or not your reasoning is actually following a logical explanation, or whether or not your reasoning actually already match or already suitable within the current context, or whether or not this is in line within the motions. And secondly, reasoning also can be in the form of why it is significant. So the importance of your argument and how it is significantly impact the vulnerable actors that you claim to defend. So why it is significant is also one of the important things, especially in British parliamentary, because we also have a opening and closing theme. So if you are closing, especially, you need to explain more than why your argumentation is very significant in compared to your opening badge, for example. And thirdly is to explain why is it exclusive. So why to achieve the goals, the impact you can only do by your own proposal. So you can explain why status quo alternative or why status quo solution is not exclusive, or you can explain why the alternative that has been provided by your opponent team is not exclusive in compared to your own team and your own argumentation. And lastly, the comparative. This is also important. Not in comparative doesn't necessarily only rely into you on how you want to rebut or on how you want to negate something, but the comparative also is exists where you provide your reasoning. You can imagine how the world would look like in opponent and compare why theirs are worse and will not achieve the maximum benefit of the goal. So the comparative, you need to explain what is your ideal world, and also you can directly compare why the world in your opponent team is not going to solve any kind of issue or would not provide any kind of benefit. So that is going to win that's going to champion you on the debate. So give a proper comparative in order to make judges or your opponent understand why you are significant, why you are exclusive, and why your argumentation is true. And thirdly is link back. This is also the part that always I think that sometimes debaters forget to provide a link back. So link back, the function of link back is actually to prove why your argument is relevant to the motion. Secondly, which part of your previous speaker's case that you are strengthening. And thirdly, which part of your opponent case that you are destroying. And lastly, this is also can be used to show why you have said is important for the debate. So sometimes you can actually explain why all your reasoning start from assertion and reasoning, and when you provide example, for example, or any kind of evidence why that is something that is really important for the debate, and why your argumentation is something that is much that give more contribution in compared to your opponent case. So that is the function of the link back. So don't forget to provide the link back in your argumentations. So after you make a complete argumentation, then you need to understand how what kind of rebuttals or how you construct rebuttals in a debate. So firstly, you need to understand that there is a problem solution gap. Okay, next slide, Kapira. Problem solution gap. So you need to explain. You need to prove, or you need to understand, or you need to what you need to explain what is the gap of your opponent's stance. So firstly, you can explain by prove how the case as will not effectively solve the problem that they claim. And secondly, you can counter propose something that would marginally more effective at tackling the problem, or the more effective or the better solution in compared to the solution that has been given by your opponent. So the reason why this is very important, this is also will neutralize any kinds of moral argument or principle that the team is trying to bring. So the problem solution gap, you need to explain why the problem solution gap that your opponent already explained is not actually the best solution or the better solution in compared to what you are going to prove on the debate. So this is just to neutralize every kinds of argument that might be very, very good from your opponent. So you need to understand about the gap of the problem and solution in their argumentation. And secondly, next slide. Kavira, next slide. Okay, so secondly is on how you prove the lack of completeness in argumentation. So an argument is judged based on whether it explains three things. Firstly, why it is likely to be true. So the likelihood of the argumentation or the process that has been provided by your opponent, whether or not the likelihood is there, whether or not the process would actually achieve the goals or the stance of their team. And secondly, prove why it is significant in the debate. Then you explain why your argumentation is much more significant in compared to their argumentation. And lastly, why it can be only achieved through the proposal, or what is your exclusivity, what makes you different within your opponent. So as an opponent, you can tackle at any kind of this level. So you might choose whether you want to respond the likelihood, or yes, it's better if you can prove these three things, why then their argumentation is not true, why the likelihood is not there, why they're not significant, and why they're not exclusive. So this is how you complete the lack of completeness in the argumentation. And next is about negation. Deny every claim that has been explained by your opponent. So you need to understand that in rebuttals, if you understand that if you know that their claim or their statement, their assertion, their reasoning is not true, then you need to give a and provide explanation that this is untrue. So you can explain it by battle of different characterization of actor leads into different action or reaction. So negation is very important, but also doesn't necessarily you always need to do this kind of negation in every argumentation. If you think that sometimes their statement is true, but you can explain why that is not significant, or why that is not exclusive, or why the status quo already solved the issue, or the action that has been taken in status quo actually already solve any kinds of problem that has been explained by your opponent team. So that is the function of negation. And next is about naturalize. So naturalize is to explain why their concern is also applicable on your case. So naturalize in here, you need to, yes, just like what I said before, sometimes their concern is actually similar within our stance or our concern. So then you need to also explain why their concern or why their stance is also still applicable on your own case with your own way. So you need to understand the status quo. This is the importance why you need to understand the context, or you need to understand and update about the information that exists in the current status quo. Because whenever you want to neutralize something, then you need to have a proper knowledge whether this is also applicable on your in your case, or this is applicable within the situation that exists in the current status quo. And next, um, after you respond, after you rebut, then sometimes your opponent might be true, then you could provide even if explanation. This the function of even if actually assuming their argument can work, then the outcome will not be achieved the way they want it. So just explain why the likelihood, or why the process, or any kind of mechanism that they provide in the debate would not be achieved just like what they already explained. And also you can also explain why the outcome will be worse and will be better on your own side of on your side of the house. So this is actually the function of the even if argumentation. So you need to make sure whether their statement is true. Whenever their statement is true, then you need to find the explanation why they are worsened, or why they would not achieve any kind of goals in their side of the house. And then the other way to rebut, to see the common flaws in arguments. So you can find the flaws in argument by identify the assertion. So an argument might not be argument at all. This is just simply as an assertion. This is what I explained before, because sometimes the reasoning is not there, the logical gap is there. So yeah, you need to identify, and you need to um, give more attention to to your opponent's speech, because on that kind of level you can actually could understand what kind of mistakes or what kind of common flaws that might be exist. So that might be also exist in assertion. So your opponent might not provide neither logical reason or process of their assertion. So how we can respond it? Two kinds of way. Firstly, point out why there has not been enough analysis to prove why their argument is valid. And secondly, prove why assertion is not intuitively true, because A doesn't simply create B. So yes, you need to understand about the logical gap that exists inside of the debate. And secondly, you can identify the common flaws by Next slide. By understand about the contradiction that might be delivered by your opponent. So the argument might be valid, but in contradiction with the previous argument. So this is also the important part to always write down what your opponent say, because yes, you can identify the contradiction by compare their previous argument or their previous context within what within the next argumentation. So a full-blown contradiction is when it is impossible for both to be true simultaneously. So the condition might not be happen in the same time in simultaneously. So you can actually identify the contradiction by understand the differentiation, the difference between the first and the second argumentation. So you can make sure the theme is really contradictory, or it can cause a massive damage to the credibility. So how you respond this? You need to point out where the contradiction happened, and secondly, you need to point out how the contradiction compromised the credibility of the case. And then, lastly, the other way to rebut, uh, to see the common flaws of causal causation. So this is when your opponent try to link to event without showing how the former event will cause the latter to happen. So how you respond this? You can use this kind of parameter. Firstly, point out how A does not lead to B. So there is a missing analysis on their explanation. And secondly, point out that there are two other factors that might lead to B. And thirdly, point out that even if B happen, B is not an ideal consequence in the context of the debate or make people life worse off. And lastly, you can do a defensive response. So you point out your proposal will be more effective way to reach B. So you understand that the goals or how you achieve B is also important, but you explain why your likelihood, why your process, or why your mechanism is something that much more better in order to reach or to achieve B. And then the other things after rebuttals is fiat. So fiat is actually an advantage for government team that firstly all the technicalities are assumed available, and secondly the proposal will be passed in the Congress or in the Parliament. However, you need to notice that doesn't necessarily it's assumed that all states have unlimited funding, and secondly all Congress or Parliament will actually give a full support. So you cannot directly assume this kind of thing when you get a motion that talk about state, or you want to talk about policy motion when you want to create when you want to change something, you want to change a policy, doesn't necessarily Congress or Parliament will give all the support. So you need to characterize whether or not the Parliament is actually following the interest of your of society, or whether or not the Parliament actually also will contribute and support the community that you want to support. So that is the fiat. And also as point of information. So point of information, you can use POI uh, as a first to clarify something. Whenever you want to ask, or you can throw it in a form of statement or question, you can clarify it into 15 seconds. And secondly, you also can provide your rebuttal into point of information. And thirdly, you pointing out the contradiction that might be exist in the debate. And lastly, you can reframing your team's narrative. So especially in British parliamentary, because closing actually not speak early, so you need to always engage in the debate. So you need to give a point of information in order the opening team could also engage in your own case. Now, the reason why this is important, because yes, just like what Vira told you at the very first place, because we have four teams in the debate, then all the teams need to have their own identity. If you're a closing team and you don't want to give a point of information because you just want to keep your arguments and you want to keep it until you speech, this is something that is not will not actually create when this is not a good solution for your team, because a point of information actually can be a platform for the debaters or the team to engage one another, especially when you are closing. Then you can actually identify or clarify what is exactly your identity in the debate, so that is also make you could make your team upper hand in compared to another team. So yes, that is all the explanation and the technical meeting of NUDC. Kavira, tentang ini apa skornya harus kita ini kah?
Oh ya, tentang skor.
Yep.
I stop share first. Let me open it first. Scoring. Oh, scoring. Wait. So for this internal selection, we will explain to you how we score the debaters. So we have a range of score from 69 to 81. The 69 is the lowest score that you can get, and 88 is the highest score that you can get. The average score from 69 to 81 is 75. So these are basically the explanation of how can you reach 69, how can you reach 70, how can you reach 71, and the other. So if you are the speaker, in your speech is visibly very confused and very confusing, no structure at all, no role fulfillment, and no relevant content. So basically, maybe you just speech re-mentioning the motion, or you just do salam, for example, you can get 69 because there is no anything that we can get from your speech. You can get 70 when you are a speaker that greatly makes relevant claims, but the speech is difficult to follow and has little to no structure and shows lack of awareness of the speaker's role. So maybe you do speak in your 7 minute speech. Maybe you don't reach 7 minutes too, but what you mentioned are something that not so much relevant from the motion. You just example re-explaining the motion, what the motion means, maybe the Wikipedia definition of the motion, and there is no structure that can be followed. Also, there is no role fulfillment that you fulfilled. So we think that you are fit the score of 70. You can get 71 is maybe if maybe you are do the speech but often relevant, the speech that is often relevant but rarely makes a complete argument. The speech is frequently unclear and confusing, has problematic structure, but reflects awareness of the speaker's role. So for example, if you are aware that you are as a prime minister, you have to make an argument, you have to make a context, you have to make a mechanism, you have to make a definition, but with no explanation of at all of what do you mean by the definition, what do you mean by the mechanism, or you're just mentioning your opinion in a one line sentence of the motion. We think that you are fitting to the 71. You will get 72 if you're a speaker that frequently makes relevant arguments. So maybe your arguments are also relevant. You are mentioning one to two sentence of argumentation that are relevant. that is relevant, but with very simplistic explanation. For example, you are just mentioning, you think that it's good to do A, you think that it's bad to do A, but without explaining why doing A is good or why doing B is good, the benefit of doing A is to whom, the benefit or the harm of doing B is to whom. So no explanation at all. No explanation at all, or even though it's there, it's very simplistic. Just by, for example, you are just generally explaining that doing A is automatically good because A needs it, for example. And the speech is understandable, but most of the time also difficult to follow. So we understand what you are talking about, but because there is no structure there, or poor structure, it's very difficult to follow the flow of your argumentation. And the speech also indicates poor attempt in role fulfillment. So if the above 71, the score of 71 is that you are aware of your speaker's role, you aware that you have to do definition, mechanism, and etc. etc. In 72, you are trying so hard to fulfill the role fulfillment, but there is a poor attempt in fulfilling it all. For example, you're just aware you are trying to fulfill, but there is a poor fulfillment at the end of the day. You can get 73 to 74 if your arguments are generally relevant with several explanations, but obvious logical gaps. So, for example, you are explaining that uh, doing A, doing A will create worse condition and status quo. For example, you mention all the worst conditions and status quo. You mention how the worst conditions are very much significantly harming the actors, for example. But there's a logical gaps of explanation of why the worst scenarios or the harm will happen, for example. What is the trigger? What is the likelihood? Why A or the actor also will be harmed? Why the actor uh, can be considered as an actor that can be harmed, for example, by the harm that you mentioned. So there are obvious logical gaps that when we hear your argumentation, we in instantly having these questions to fill the logical gaps in your speech. And also the speech may have multiple simplistic or irrelevant explanation. The speech is clear but not compelling, shows incomplete role fulfillment, and has imperfect structure. So maybe you do fulfill your 7 minute speech with an effort of role fulfillment, an effort of explaining your argumentation, but there's a logical gap. Your structure are there, but maybe not structurized or are imperfect. We think that you can deserve to get 73 or 74. The average that you can get is 75. It's average in every aspect. What we mean is that in role fulfillment, you can fulfill the role fulfillment. You, as a prime minister, for example, you do your job to make contacts, you do your job to define the motion, you do your job on mechanism, or for example, as closing bench, you do your job in differentiating yourself to another teams, you do your job in doing a new argumentation, for example, you do your job in giving rebuttals, for example. What can make you average and why you cannot get 76, for example, is because we still find the structure are slightly imperfect, the explanation are not complete yet, there are so much questions that should be asked and elaboration that are expected from your explanation. Also, maybe your argumentation are simplistic, but there is a kind of elaboration there. You are trying, for example, to explain it, but still left with so much questions that can be elaborated more. So you can get 76 to 77 if the arguments are almost exclusively relevant to the motion and frequently persuasive. The way you speak, the way you deliver your argumentation, the way you deliver the harms and the either the benefit are persuasively attracting for the adjudicator and also another debater. Although the speaker occasionally slips into lack of explanation and simplistic argument prone to strong responses. So sometimes, though you make a very relevant argumentation, a very much compelling speech, but there are a loophole of explanation that you forget to explain. For example, um, an explanation of details, for example, that you forget to explain, while the details are very much significant or very much important in contributing towards the way of your urgency, for example, or the way of your characteristic and contextualization, for example, you can get 76 to 77. And for the structure, we can follow the structure. We see the structure, and this role fulfillment are also checklisted. So you can get 78 when the speech is also almost completely clear. We can directly understand what you mean, what your argumentations are, why the harms are significant, and with a relevant arguments and sufficient explanation. The speaker is persuasive and has successfully fulfilled their role. The structure is unlikely to be problematic at all. So this is a good score if you can reach to that. 79 is that the speaker has a very good arguments that engage well with the most important issues in the debate and is very compelling. For example, in VP debate, you engage to all of scenarios that might happen. You engage to the argumentation from the opening government. You engage to argumentation of opening opposition and also closing opposition if you are closing government. Or as an opening opposition, you engage to an argument from opening government, or after that also you are expecting or you can predict what might be talked in closing bench, and you already rebut it, or you already giving a preemptive argumentation upon that. So it's a very compelling speech. The speaker has clear delivery and is persuasive with almost flawless role fulfillment and structure. Opponents need to provide sophisticated responses to refute the speaker's argument. So when you are a 79 speakers, your opponents will have the very much burden to rumble down your point with a sophisticated responses, to rebut your point, to refute your point that has been rebut, that your point that rebut their argumentation, and etc. etc. You are an 80 speaker if you have a brilliant arguments, very well explained, and successfully engaged with the main issues in the debate. The speaker is very much clear and very compelling. Opponents need to provide extremely sophisticated responses to refute the speaker's argument. So in 79, you have to provide sophisticated responses. In 80, you have to provide extremely sophisticated responses. So these are very high scores that someone can get. And lastly, you are an 18-1 speaker. If your speech is the best that we can see, you have and will ever hear in your current and next life, completely flawless, literally life-changing, and almost impossible to rebut. So it's very hard for you to, for example, penetrating towards their points, to rebut in whichever side possible, and you think that it's very hard to rebut, it's very hard to rumble down their points, and it's very hard for you also to analyze that we can make such an argument, for example. So you are an 81 speaker if you are reaching that characteristics of speaker. So that's very much all for the speaker scores. We hope you do these characteristics of speakers. We do hope you also can reach to that speaker points, and we hope you also very much high speaker scores for your self-improvement. Okay, that's all for the scoring.
Okay, I think that is enough. If you have any further question, you can actually contact us in the group, or you might give your question through technical meeting. Ini ada lagi tuh Kak, technical meetingnya?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we will still have technical meeting at 1 o'clock.
Okay.
Kalau misalnya setelah kalian nonton materinya dan kalian punya list of questions, kalian bisa tanya di situ. We will answer that there. Okay. Thank you guys. Happy debating.
Good luck for
Okay.